You are listening to the Cabin of Horrors podcast. Go behind the scenes of all your favorite horror movies from the 70s, 80s, 90s, and now. I am your host, the incredible Josh.
Hello, everybody. Thanks so much for tuning in to episode 1, season 3 of Cabin of Horrors podcast. We are on season 3. How freaking cool is that? And there's just been so much that has happened with the podcast the last year, let alone the last few weeks. I have some stuff to catch you all up on. First of all, I want to thank everybody who has come out and support us on Twitch the last few weeks, because it has been phenomenal. It's been an absolute blast coming back on Twitch and streaming classic horror movies and TV shows. That by far was probably the best decision I made for my Twitch channel, because for one, you're all loving it. Everyone's coming by, hanging out. I really want to thank my community, and there's specific people I want to thank because it's been a year, right? Like last week was the 1-year anniversary of Cabin of Horrors. It was the 1 year for when I dropped the first podcast episode, the 90s horror movies, which is still up, by the way. I don't know why I still have season 0 up, but I think I'm going to just leave it up now because for some reason, all of you seem to love it. Even though I think those episodes are crap, a lot of people are going back and actually listening to them, and it's getting a lot of plays, so I'm going to leave it. I'm not going to touch it. If you guys want to hear how Cabin of Horrors started, it'll stay there. You guys can enjoy it. Another thing that's going to be sticking around, as you may have noticed, is Nightmare on the 13th. I know I said it was only going to be around for a week, but I'm going to leave it up. And the reason being is because Nightmare on the 13th has changed as well. But before we go into that, let me tell you what's going on with Cabin of Horrors as a whole right now. So the podcast, as you can tell, is back. We're going to be dropping episodes every Tuesday for season 3, 4, 5, all the way up to 100. The podcast is not going anywhere, but what we've added is our Twitch channel. So what we do on Twitch now is stream classic horror movies and TV shows. And when I say classic, this is everything from the 1930s to mid-1970s. Basically everything the podcast doesn't cover is going to be on the Twitch account, because I'm not going to talk about movies from the 30s, 40s, and 50s. That's not what the podcast does. But Twitch, you can go and check out all of those classic horror movies pretty much every single day, because I am going live on Twitch every single day from 8 a.m. to 10 p.m. with classic horror movies, TV shows. You can come by, hang out, lurk while you work, and just watch. And then on Friday and Saturday nights, I've developed as authentic of a drive-in experience as you can get in the comfort of your own home. Like, I've got drive-in ads, cartoons, drive-in movies, everything you can think of. So if you're not doing anything Friday, Saturday night, come by my Twitch channel, twitch.tv/Cabin of Horrors, and you can follow if you want. You can create a Twitch account. You don't need a Twitch account. It's up to you. All that you really need to do to support the Cabin is watch. You don't even need a Twitch account. So if you want to come by, support Cabin, or even just watch some classic horror movies, twitch.tv/Cabin of Horrors. And it's been such a fun time doing that since we've gone back on Twitch. We're not going to stop. We're going to keep airing these movies. We're going to keep having a good time. So make sure you come by and drop a follow. Now for Nightmare on the 13th, there was a lot of feedback and a lot of love for Nightmare on the 13th. And it just blew me away. Everybody that I talked to loved it. And if you haven't heard it yet, it's still up. I'm going to keep it up. It is a retelling, reimagining of Halloween 1 and 2, which I absolutely love how it came out. Nightmare on the 13th was a project that was months in the making for me in my own head, and I'm glad that I finally was able to do it and put it out there for you all, and you guys liked it. And the feedback I got was actually really surprising, because I would say probably 25 to 30 of you messaged me after that and said that I should be doing audiobook readings. So I really thought about it, because since the podcast is so focused on horror movies, I didn't think you guys would want to hear me do audiobooks. I really didn't. So that's why I went the Nightmare on the 13th route, did a horror movie and turned that into a story. But since so many of you said that you wanted it, now I'm going to do it. So every Sunday night live on Twitch, I will be doing a storybook reading. And this same storybook reading will be released later, probably on YouTube. I don't know if I'm going to be releasing these on podcast platforms because, well, I need something for my YouTube channel. I'm just being honest. I don't have a YouTube channel for Cabin of Horrors yet, and I need something for it. So I think we're going to move the audio readings to YouTube, and that's where we're going to be dropping them after they go live on Sunday. So if you want to hear me do an audio reading live, then you're going to want to come out on Sunday. The first one we're doing is The Case of Lady Sanix, the short story that to this day haunts me and sticks with me. It is the most impactful short story that I have ever read, and I will be reading it live on Twitch next Sunday. But if you can't catch it live, that's okay. It'll be up on YouTube most likely the Tuesday after that. Now, since it is the 1-year anniversary of Cabin of Horrors as well, I want to take a moment to thank some very specific people, because there are people who have literally been with me since the beginning, and there's people who have just hopped on board and went buck wild and just dived right into that Cabin of Horrors community. So there's specific people that I just want to take a moment to thank after this 1 year for sticking around and being awesome fans. The first person that I want to thank for being such an awesome fan and just sticking it out literally from the beginning is Skellington Fan on Instagram. And she's been nothing but awesome to Cabin of Horrors literally since we started, and has listened, I'm pretty sure, to every single episode that I've released. So, Skellington Fan, you are awesome. I know you're probably listening right now. Thank you for being such an awesome fan. I really appreciate it. Now, the other people I want to thank are people directly from our Twitch community. First person I want to thank is the person who was the reason I got on Twitch, and literally my one and only Patreon subscriber, and that is Scareborn. Scareborn on Twitch. If you haven't heard of him, follow him at twitch.tv/Scareborn. Great guy. I want to thank him for being such a great supporter of Cabin. I also want to thank 3 more people. 2 of them are newer to our community and have just been absolutely awesome to hang out with on Twitch, and someone who's been around with me since the beginning on Twitch. So Farrell's Barkley Lives, my homie, thank you so much for everything you do, hanging out, being an awesome person just in general. You are just amazing. I want to thank you for being a great supporter of Cabin. I also want to thank Is It the Shoes? You are great. You are an awesome community member, and it's been so much fun hanging out with you. And I can't forget my #1 movie recommender, Geeky Raven Stream. If you're listening to this, dude, thank you for recommending the horror movies on Twitch. You have given some awesome suggestions for horror movies to watch. They've been freaking great, and I super appreciate you being a part of the community. So all of you, thank you so much. If I missed anybody, I'm so sorry. Don't take it personally, but I just really love the community that we have here on Twitch and on Instagram. Thank you all so freaking much. And if you're not following me on Instagram, you can catch me at instagram.com/Cabin of Horrors podcast. But now that I've gotten all that out of the way, let's dive into the podcast episode and talk about Insidious. We're going to be going over the entire Insidious film franchise in one episode. So it's probably jam-packed. I have no idea how long this is going to be until we get there. But I hope you guys stick around for the ride and enjoy talking about what I consider to be one of the greatest story-driven paranormal franchises in existence. Insidious is an American horror film franchise that was created by Lee Wannell, and there's currently 4 films released, and a 5th one's going to be coming out later this year. In total, all 4 films have grossed $542 million worldwide. On a combined budget, okay, this is a budget of all 4 films of $26.5 million. So it literally made, as a franchise, over $500 million. So no doubt we're getting another one. Now, the first 2 films of the Insidious series were directed by James Wan. The 3rd one was directed by Lee Wannell, and the 4th one was directed by Adam Robitel. And we're going to do something very different than we ever have done when it comes to franchise reviews at the Cabin of Horrors. Because what we always do, right, is we start off at the first movie that was released, go all the way up to the last one. But what we're going to do for Insidious is we're going to go over the movies in chronological story order. So not necessarily the order that they were released, but the order of the actual story. So if you want to watch Insidious before Insidious 5 comes out, this episode will go over the entire story from start to finish chronologically. So we're going to be talking about the third Insidious film, then the fourth, and then we're going to go back and talk about the first and second, because that's how the story plays out in a chronological timeline. Even though it was released, obviously, 1, 2, 3, 4, the story goes 3, 4, 1, 2. And 5 is going to fall after 2. So in terms of the entire chronological timeline, once 5 is released, it'll be 3, 4, 1, 2, 5, if you want to watch it in story-driven order. Insidious Chapter 3 was announced on September 15th, 2013, and Patrick Wilson was asked about returning for the sequel, and he went on to say that he didn't know where else the story could go after Insidious 2, and that Josh Lambert had been through the ringer, and he thinks the movie sets it up well at the end, and that that's how it should end. It was then announced that the film would release on April 3rd, 2015. However, the date later was moved to May 29th, 2015. Before the film was released on March 11th, 2014, we found out that the third film of the Insidious franchise was not going to focus on the Lambert family, which was the family that was being focused on in Insidious 1 and 2. This was going to be a new family and a new story and would not connect to that last scene in the second film. And it was also reported that both Lee Wannell and Angus Sampson were going to return as ghost hunters Speck and Tucker, along with Lynn Shay as Elise. Principal photography of the film began on July 9th, 2014 in Los Angeles, and it was under the working title of Into the Further. Several scenes were shot in the San Fernando Valley in the Delfino Studios in Sylmar, where the Brenner Apartments interiors were initially built. For box office of Insidious Chapter 3, it went on to gross $52.2 million in North America, and then $60.6 million across the world. So it got a worldwide total of $112.8 million with a $10 million budget. So Insidious makes tons of bank, even just as its own. A single movie makes so much bank. Like, this movie made $42.2 million in North America alone. It made over $100 million. That's just absolutely incredible. So let's dive into the plot of Insidious 3, talk about the story, and then continue on to Insidious 4, called The Last Key. So the year is 2007. It's 3 years before the Lambert haunting. So Insidious Chapter 3 is actually a prequel to Insidious 1 and 2, which is of course the reason why we're going over it first. So we meet the teenager Quinn Brenner, and he's meeting with a retired demonologist named Elise Rainier. Elise reluctantly agrees to try and contact the spirit of Quinn's mother Lily, who had died 1 year prior. However, Elise urges Quinn not to try and contact her mother again because she begins to sense a malevolent force. We then see Grace, who's an elderly woman that lives at Quinn's apartment building and suffers from dementia. She starts saying really strange and cryptic things to Quinn, seeming to allude to an unseen spirit. Later on, Quinn's attending an audition for a performance arts school, and after leaving the audition, she begins to see a mysterious figure waving to her from a distance on the street. This distracts her, and she gets hit by a car, effectively breaking both of her legs. She's now stuck at home, bedridden, and her father Sean and brother Alex are also there with her. Quinn begins to experience some really disturbing paranormal phenomenon, including seeing visions of a dark spirit wearing an oxygen mask known as the Man Who Can't Breathe. Quinn realizes that he's actually the same figure she saw when she was hit by a vehicle. We then find out later on that the elderly woman who had been saying these strange and cryptic things to Quinn in her apartment building has actually now passed away. We then go back to Elise, who's meeting with Sean, and both of them are grieving over the death of her husband Jack. Sean tries to convince Elise to help his daughter. However, she declines, stating that her previous visits to the dark spiritual world known as the Further made her realize that an evil spirit called the Bride in Black is actually hunting her down. However, she's convinced by her friend and former colleague Carl to continue using her spiritual ability because he reminds her about a successful case involving Josh Lambert in 1986. This is referencing back when Josh Lambert was a kid and was hypnotized by Elise, which we're going to get into later on. But that was a successful case for her and reminds her that she's stronger than the spirits because she's still alive after that incident. Now, because of Elise's initial refusal to help the family, Alex suggests to Sean that he call on an alleged demonologist, Specs and Tucker. They've built a following on the internet, so they figure they're going to give them a call and see if they can help. During their investigation, Quinn briefly becomes possessed by the man who can't breathe, and he attacks Sean, Specs, and Tucker. Sean realizes that Specs and Tucker are actually frauds, and he prepares to kick them out when Elsie arrives. They deduce that the Dark Spirit's goal is to lure potential victims to the further so that it can eat their life force. Elise decides that she's going to enter the spiritual world herself, and she enlists the help of Specs and Tucker. So Elise enters the further, and she has a fight with the Bride in Black before she discovers her husband Jack's spirit. Jack begins to encourage Elise to commit suicide so that they can be reunited together forever. However, Elise realizes that Jack is actually the man who can't breathe in disguise and orders it to release Quinn. Quinn then appears. Elise and the man who can't breathe engage in a struggle over Quinn before Elise escapes the further and realizes that Quinn actually has to defeat him on her own. Though Quinn is at first at a disadvantage, and Elise receives a message from Grace's spirit. Lily had left Quinn a letter to read before she graduated high school, but Quinn never found it. Elise calls out to Lily's spirit to help when Lily suddenly appears in the further and helps Quinn defeat the man who can't breathe by inspiring her to stand up for herself and pull off his mask. This seemingly suffocates the man who can't breathe and destroys him, even though he apparently can't breathe. But we're going to walk past that. We're not going to talk about that. Quinn at this point escapes the further, and Elise gives parting words to the family, including words of encouragement from Lily's spirit. She leaves with Specs and Tucker, and the three of them agree that they're going to form a partnership and start paranormal investigating together. Later in her home, Elise's dog starts barking at an unseen force. Even though Elise can't see what's behind her, there's a demon with a red face watching. And that wraps us up for Insidious Chapter 3. Which was a great film and did a really good job of building up the films to come. Like, if you were to watch this in the chronological order like we're going over now, it would be super impactful for you because you're going to see tons of little Easter eggs and foreshadows for what is to come. And it makes me super excited for Insidious Chapter 5 too, because based on the trailer, based on the characters we see returning, it's going to be a wild time. And I'm pretty sure that man with the red face, he's the villain for Insidious Chapter 5. Pretty sure he's going to be the big bad. We've got the red door. Anyways, we'll talk about Insidious Chapter 5 when it comes out. I've got tons of theories, but I don't want to say anything right now because I don't want to be wrong. But anyways, we're going to move over to the next movie in our review now, which is Insidious 4, titled The Last Key. So before Insidious Chapter 3 was released, someone had asked Lee Wannell about a potential sequel to Chapter 3. Lee Wannell said at the time that he hadn't really thought about it, but he would like to explore the time between the third film and the first film, which is a whole area where Elise had rediscovered her gift and what kind of adventure she had during that time, and really that became the basis of Insidious 4: The Last Key. They continue the story of the third movie, and in a way that shows the adventures of Elise and how she rediscovers her powers and her gifts and uses those to help other people. It was announced on May 16th, 2016, that Insidious: The Last Key was going to be released on October 20th, 2017, with Lin Shaye, of course, reprising her role as Elise Rainier. Principal photography of the film began on August 2016 and then ended the following month. We saw the release of Insidious: The Last Key actually on January 5th, 2018, and it went on to make, of course, tons of bank. Insidious: The Last Key grossed $67.6 million in the United States and Canada, $100.1 million in other territories. So it made a worldwide total of $167.9 million on a budget of $10 million. So it made even more money than Insidious Chapter 3 did. This movie went on to make a total of $157.9 million in profit, which is absolutely incredible and definitely well-deserved. This was another great entry in the Insidious franchise for sure. And there's not much to talk about in terms of the production and all that kind of stuff. I haven't been able to find much on this movie, but that's okay, because we're going to talk about the plot, it's the story that matters, and then we're going to go behind the scenes of 1 and 2 right after. So the movie starts us off in 1953, and we see Elise Rainier living in Five Keys, New Mexico, with her parents Audrey and Gerald, along with her younger brother Christian. Elise and Christian encounter a ghost in their bedroom. Of course, this scares the crap out of them, and Christian's looking for a whistle that their mother gave him to call for help, but unfortunately can't find it. After Elise gets locked in the basement by Gerald, she discovers a mysterious red doorway and then briefly becomes possessed by a demonic spirit. Audrey is then killed by the demon as well. We then fast forward decades later. We're in California in the year 2010, and Elise is working as a paranormal investigator with her colleagues Specs and Tucker. A man named Ted Garza calls and says that he's been experiencing paranormal activity in his house. And then Elise realizes that the house he's talking about is her own childhood home, so she departs to help him out. While investigating the issue, she ends up finding Christian's lost whistle from when she was a kid. But unfortunately, it disappears again after she encounters a female spirit. Elise tells Specs and Tucker that she had seen the spirit before when she was a young girl. She'd actually fled the house in fear of another beating from her father, abandoning Christian. So Elise, Tucker, and Specs meet Melissa and Imogen, who are Christian's daughters. Christian is still furious at Elise for abandoning him, and she really hopes that they can repair their relationship. So she hands Melissa a photo of the whistle, telling her to show it to Christian. Elise and Tucker then discover that there's a hidden room in the basement of this home. She's then guided by the female spirit, and they discover that a young woman is actually being held prisoner inside the house. Ted reveals that he's the one responsible for this, and he locks the entire group in and tries to kill Specs. However, in self-defense, Specs ends up killing Ted. Police show up, they end up clearing the house. Christian and his daughters go inside, and they find the whistle. But at this time, Melissa gets attacked by the demon from Elise's past, known as Keyface. Keyface sends her into a coma, and her consciousness is now stuck in the spirit realm of the Further. Elise decides then that she's going to try and save Melissa. She searches the house and discovers hidden suitcases containing belongings of numerous other women who had been held prisoner in the home, including the young woman she had seen as a girl. Elise realizes that, like Ted, her father Gerald had also kidnapped women and held them in the secret room. The woman she had seen as a girl was actually alive at that point. She wasn't a ghost, but she was later killed by Gerald. Elise is then ambushed by Keyface, and her spirit now gets taken into the Further. We then discover that Imogen possesses abilities very similar to Elise's, and she then enters the Further and is led by Anna's ghost into a prison realm where Keyface is holding all of the souls that he has taken, including Melissa and Elise. Elise realizes at this time that Keyface had been controlling both Gerald and Ted, and feeds on the fear and hatred that's generated by the women they kidnapped. Keyface then tries to coerce Elise into hurting her father's spirit as revenge for what he's done, and it works. Elise starts beating Gerald, but then is stopped by Imogen and refuses to feed Keyface any more hatred. This is when Keyface attacks Elise, but Gerald actually saves her before he gets stabbed by Keyface and his spirit vanishes. Keyface then stabs Melissa, causing her physical body to start dying. He then attempts to possess Elise, but Elise blows Christian's whistle, and that's when Audrey's spirit arrives, which vanquishes Keyface. They open a door and they see a young boy, Dalton Lambert. Realizing that they opened the wrong door, they leave the door open and find Melissa. Melissa's spirit returns to her body in the real world, saving her life. Elise then makes amends with her mother's spirit, and she and Imogen return to the real world and reunite with Christian, who at this point forgives Elise for everything she'd done and the abandonment issues that he had. However, Elise goes to sleep and has a dream about Dalton and a red-faced demon. She awakens and receives a call from Lorraine. Elise had helped her son years earlier, and now her grandson Dalton needs the same help. So it's amazing to me how all these movies are so connected, right? Because 1 came out, 2 came out, 3 came out, 4 came out. But they were able to take 3 and 4 and make it a true prequel that tied very well into 1 and 2. And Wannell is very good at weaving story pieces in before you even know what's going on. Prime example, Insidious 1. I don't know if we'll talk about this in depth as we're going in, so I'll just talk about it now. That scene in Insidious 1 where they're hearing the ghost noises, they're hearing the knocking, the doors are opening, and then you find out in Insidious 2 that was actually Josh's character. Like, the way that Wannell is able to make things happen in one movie that you think is something, and then in the second movie, you find out it's something completely different, but it makes sense. Absolutely incredible. I love how they tie all the Insidious movies together, whether it be a twist, whether it be just something you thought you knew, but then you find out that you thought incorrectly, and that's not what's happening. I love how they did Insidious. To me, it's like the paranormal Saw. Right? Like, in terms of story, in terms of twists, in terms of how they execute the story itself, I feel like Wannell said, hey, what happens if we take Saw and put it in the paranormal universe in terms of a story? Because they did a really good job. I don't know, that's just my opinion. But we're going to move on to the next entry, which is actually the first entry in the Insidious franchise. And funny enough, considering my comparisons, Insidious actually came about as a result of the success of Saw. James Wan, of course, directed the first Saw film and worked with Leigh Whannell on writing the screenplay and all that kind of stuff. And Wan had stated in an interview with Entertainment Weekly that he was, of course, very proud of Saw. However, because of the violence and gore in it, it put off a lot of people and made them hesitant to work with him. So, this is why they made Insidious. Wan and Whannell made Insidious in part to prove that they could make a film without the level of violence and gore found in the Saw series. This was their proof of concept to say, hey, no, we're good directors, we're good writers, we can do this without the violence. And they sure as hell freaking did. Principal photography for Insidious was completed over the course of 3 weeks in 2010, from late April to mid-May, and it was shot at the Herald Examiner building in downtown Los Angeles. Something that really always struck me when it came to the Insidious franchise was the score, especially the first film. The first film, the score, was just terrifying. From when the Insidious opening title screen comes in and you get that like loud just like orchestra, oh man, I'm telling you right now, that scared the shit out of me at the beginning of the film. And the musical score to Insidious was composed by Joseph Bishara, who also appears in the film actually as the demon. The music's performed with a quartet and a piano, and a bulk of the score was actually improvised and structured in the editing process, although some recording sessions did begin prior to filming. James Wan, on describing the approach of the film's soundtrack, he was quoted as saying that he wanted a lot of the scare sequences to play really silent. But what I like to do with the soundtrack is set you on edge with a really loud, sort of like scratchy violin score, mixing with some really weird piano bangs, and take that away, and all of a sudden you're like, what just happened there? Which I agree that is exactly what they did, because the use of silence in that film, and then the use of just loud, on edge orchestra after that is just, the way they mixed it was absolutely perfect. I wouldn't change a thing. Insidious 3 grossed a total of $54 million in the US and then $46.1 million internationally. So the first Insidious movie made $100.1 million on a $1.5 million budget. How crazy is that? It made over $100 million on its first opening entry. Like, Wan and Whannell at that point are probably just thinking that, like, they have the Midas touch, right? Like, they drop Saw on a low budget, that makes millions upon millions. They drop Insidious on a low budget, that makes hundreds of millions. Like, no wonder James Wan has catapulted to such success, man, because his movies just made bank. People love it, and I agree, I'm a huge James Wan fan. I will generally watch any movie that James Wan has done. Will I like it at the end? It's hit and miss. But overall, James Wan has done some really good work. Malignant. That's all I'm going to say. And by the way, Malignant's going to be next week's episode. Spoiler alert! I loved Malignant. I watched Malignant on the weekend. Oh man, that movie was incredible. I loved it. Like, I put Malignant behind Saw and ahead of Insidious. I loved Malignant. I loved it. We're going to talk about it next week. That was a great movie. But anyways, we're talking about Insidious. So let's head into the plot of the first Insidious movie and talk about what happens in the story. We start off the movie with a married couple, Josh and Renee Lambert. They've recently moved to a new home with their sons Dalton and Foster, along with their infant daughter Callie. One evening, Dalton sneaks into the attic where he encounters a mysterious entity. The next day, he ends up slipping into a coma. Fast forward 3 months later. There's no results at the hospital for Dalton's coma. Renee and Josh end up taking Dalton back home. The family at that point starts to experience really frightening paranormal events, including strange noises, their home security alarm going off, and it just keeps repeating. Foster also claims that he has seen Dalton walking around the house in a comatose state, and Renee ends up finding a bloody handprint on Dalton's bed. As time goes on, Renee begins to see things. She sees a fiendishly long hair apparition that tries to attack her. The Lamberts at this point decide that they're going to move, and Renee believes that the house is haunted. Now, this is something I want to touch on really quick here with the first Insidious movie, because the first Insidious movie broke horror movie tropes hard. Like, the paranormal trope is that the haunting always happens in the house. Right? Before Insidious, whenever I would watch a paranormal movie, the question I would always say is just get the fuck out of the house. Right? Just leave your shit and go. Go to a hotel. Go stay with some family. Go buy a new house. When I was a kid, I thought that was easy, but it's certainly not. You can't just buy a new house. But anyways, leave. Just get out and leave. Well, in Insidious, they did. They did do that. The Lamberts are like, you know what, screw it. Our house is haunted. I'm not dealing with this. Our kid's in a freaking coma. We are moving out. We are moving out and we're going to a new place. So they did. They did exactly what fans, scream at movies to do. However, it didn't help them. Because when they moved to the new home, the supernatural activity continues, which I thought was an absolute perfect way to smash that trope on its head. Everyone's like, just leave the house, just leave. Oh, they're haunted. The people themselves are haunted, not the house. Oh, okay. So I thought that was a great way to break that trope, especially at a time where there was a lot of supernatural movies coming out in the 2010s, especially early 2010s, and they were all corny and made off the same template. But Insidious came out and said, here's your template and we'll raise you 10. And it worked for them. It worked out well. So they move to the new home, right? And they still have supernatural activity occurring. Renee ends up seeing the ghost of a young child dressed in period attire. So Josh's mother Lorraine arrives and explains to them that she also had a nightmare about a demon with a red face in Dalton's bedroom. And she later sees that same demon standing behind Josh. Dalton's bedroom then gets ransacked by unseen forces, so they decide that they're going to call in a psychic. So Lorraine calls in psychic Elise Rainier, along with her paranormal investigators, Specs and Tucker. They head into Dalton's bedroom when Elise sees the vision of the red-faced demon. She explains that Dalton's not in a coma. He was actually born with the ability to astral project his consciousness, and he's been unknowingly doing it in his sleep for quite some time, believing that he was just simply dreaming. However, this time, he's traveled too far, and now he's been captured in a purgatory realm called the Further, a place that's inhabited by the tortured spirits of the dead. Now, without Dalton's consciousness present, his body's completely comatose. However, the spirits desire to use his body so that they can re-enter the physical world. Josh at this point is just not believing any of this, though. He accuses Elise of being a scam artist and throws her out to the curb. However, after doing a search of Dalton's room, he later finds drawings that seem to confirm the theory that Elise was telling him earlier in the day. So he decides that he's going to bring Elise and her team back. Now they attempt to do a seance, and it goes horribly wrong. Just not a good scene. Elise then explains that she's actually known Lorraine, Josh's mom, for decades, and previously had actually helped Josh when he was a child, because Josh also possesses the ability to astral project. However, they had suppressed his memory of this years ago with Elise's help, because she had helped him beat a parasitic spirit of an old woman that wanted to possess Josh. They then discover that the only way that they're going to rescue Dalton is for Josh to go into the Further and be the one who saves him. So Elise puts Josh in a hypnotic trance, and he's then able to project himself into the Further. He finds his way to Dalton and encounters multiple dangerous and horrifying ghosts and demons along the way. He then tries to free his son, but they end up getting chased and attacked by the red-faced demon, while the spirits of the further are invading the real world and terrorizing Renee. Josh is then confronted by the old woman that tormented him as a child, and he tries once and for all to overcome his fear. However, she appears to retreat from him, and Josh and Dalton wake up in the real world, and the spirits seem to have vanished. The family celebrates their victory, believing that their nightmare is finally over, when Elise senses that something is wrong about Josh. So she decides she's going to snap a photo of him. Josh becomes angry, and this provokes him to strangle Elise. Renee then discovers Elise's corpse and sees the photograph she took. The photo reveals that Josh is now possessed by the ghost of the old woman from his childhood, having slipped into his body when he confronted her into the further. Josh appears behind Renee, and she lets out a frightened gasp as the movie ends. Great movie, right? Like, Insidious 1 just hits so different. They did such a good job in executing every plot point. The end was just a great cliffhanger. You don't know what's going to happen, and they literally pick it right up from the first one in Insidious Chapter 2. It's just literally the action starts right from the beginning, and you just go. Now, I really thought Insidious 2 was different as well, in the way that it was a possession film. Like, I wouldn't consider it a supernatural or paranormal film specifically. I would consider it a possession film, because now we're watching a movie where somebody's possessed pretty much the entire time. And whether people know it or not doesn't make a difference, right? What horror movie have you watched where you're actually seeing someone possessed by the demon going off the entire time, like from start to finish, they're possessed by the demon, and nobody really knows about it, right? It's usually like they get possessed, everyone knows about it, they try to get the demon out of them, but not at the beginning of Insidious 2. They had no idea. They didn't know he was possessed. So he's walking around with a possessed demon. Very interesting concept, and definitely one that I don't even think has been done again. I don't think I've seen a supernatural film that's been done like that, or a possession film, that's been done where they're possessed, at the beginning of the movie kind of deal, but they're still going off with their life, and the demon's possessing them and nobody knows it. Just a great concept. I absolutely love it. So obviously Insidious was a success, right? And discussions for a sequel soon followed. Now, there is a gap, right, between Insidious 1 and 2 in terms of how long it took to get developed. And that would be because, like, Juan and Wannell blew up, right? Like, after Insidious, they just blew up. And they even went on to do The Conjuring. They fit The Conjuring in between all of this, right? Like, if you want to do a Juan and Wannell timeline, like, it started with Insidious, but in between all of the Insidious movies, they're doing The Conjuring at the same time, which is another great film franchise. We'll definitely be going over The Conjuring sometime in the podcast, but for sure, definitely one of the best horror film franchises, hands down. So the success of Insidious, right, spawned the sequel to Insidious. They're working with producer Jason Blum on getting the second movie developed. However, Blum wasn't going to do it unless Juan and Wannell came back. Blum actually was quoted as saying that as long as there was a chance that James and Lee were going to write the second movie and direct the second movie, then he was going to do it. He didn't want to do it with somebody else. However, they kept saying they might or they might not do it, so there was kind of a back and forth on whether or not there was going to be a sequel, and that's probably because, like, there was a lot of things going on with them at the time. They were also working on The Conjuring, so they probably didn't know if they were even going to go back to Insidious. But the fact that it made, like $100 million, I think that's probably motivation enough to go back to Insidious. And they titled the film Insidious Chapter 2 because of the fact that it's a direct continuation of the first installment. However, the tone of the film is a lot more grounded than the first film. Juan cited that his work on The Conjuring was a huge influence to how he and Wannell were actually going to approach Insidious Chapter 2. So if you were watching Insidious Chapter 2 wondering why you were getting Conjuring vibes, that's why. Because Juan took a lot of what he learned from The Conjuring and used that when he was developing Insidious 2. Principal photography for it began on January 15th, 2013 in LA, and it had a slightly higher production budget than the first film. and was captured over the course of 25 days. A bulk of the film was shot at a house in Highland Park, Los Angeles, which served as the location of Lorraine Lambert's house. Another location used for filming was the former Linda Vista Community Hospital, which was redressed as a hospital setting and used for the construction of interior sets. And of course, for the musical score, Joseph Bishara came back and composed it for Chapter 2. He, of course, as we had mentioned, was the musical composer for the first film, and I'm glad they brought him back, because if you want the first and second film in a franchise to have that same tone, score is everything. Right? At least for me. Like, if a movie doesn't have a good score, it's not going to set the tone for me. For me, sounds in a horror movie are what set the tone. And I know I've talked about this before, but the score in your movie is hands down the most important thing outside of your story and acting. Because if you have let's say you had a movie with no score whatsoever, there was no sounds, no music, it would be crap. You wouldn't be feeling that same anticipation and suspense that you feel in other films, because they've established that already in filmmaking in general, that sounds and different ambiance that's happening around you, that is what's going to let your mind know something's coming, right? Something is going to scare the shit out of you, in essence. So having the same person develop the score for the first Insidious movie and the second Insidious movie definitely helps round out that tone and keep the same tone between the two films. Personally, I think that they did a really good job with that. I think they did a great job in keeping the same tone and feel while grounding the second movie a little bit more, and the execution of it was just bar none. They did a great job on this sequel. Great horror movie sequel. So in terms of bank, this Insidious film by far made the most amount of money in the Insidious franchise. Hands down. It had a budget of $5 million, grossed a worldwide total of $161,919,318. So it made literally almost $162 million. Like the second movie is by far the most profitable in the Insidious franchise, but something tells me number 5 is going to knock that out. I think the fifth Insidious franchise is going to be the most profitable, because for one, it's been years. It's been since 2013, actually. 10 years. Wow, it's actually been 10 years since we have gotten an entry in the franchise in this storyline, right? Because the third and fourth movie were the prequels to Insidious. We haven't gotten something that continues the story of Josh and Renee, right? And their children. We haven't gotten anything. Now we do with the fifth movie. Now it's going to continue that story from the second one, but it's 10 years later. If you saw the trailer, you know what is going to happen, and I am so excited for it. You know who's coming back. I'm not even going to mention it. I mentioned it earlier, but I'm not going to mention it again, because I'm just too excited, and then I'm going to go into a rabbit hole talking about Insidious 5. We need to talk about Insidious 2, so let's dive in. Let's talk about the plot, everything that happens in the story. We start off Insidious Chapter 2 in the year 1986, and Lorraine Lambert has called Elise Rainier to help her son, Josh. He's being haunted by the spirit of an old woman. So we're seeing Josh here as a child now. Elise is searching for any paranormal phenomena in the home when her arm gets slashed by an unseen force. She insists that they need to suppress Josh's astral projection abilities for his own safety and then plant altered memories into his brain. So that gives us a backstory of what happened to Josh that really brought us to where we are today in the Insidious world. We fast forward now 25 years later, and we see Renee. She's under questioning about the death of Elise. She's warned that if Josh's fingerprints are found at the crime scene, he's going to be prosecuted for Elise's murder. So the family decides that they're going to relocate to Lorraine's house, where they again begin to encounter strange paranormal events. Dalton tells his mother that he's been having really bad dreams about a woman in a white dress, and he's also hearing his dad talk to an unseen figure. Renee then receives a call from police stating that the fingerprints don't match Josh's, so they're not going to end up charging Josh with Elise's murder. However, a woman in a white dress begins attacking Renee, and Josh hears a voice urging him to kill his family. Specs and Tucker arrive, and they end up showing Lorraine a videotape from the night in 1986 when they were working with Josh as a child. They enhanced it and revealed that there's actually an adult Josh standing behind the young Josh. So they contact Elise's former colleague, Carl, who attempts to contact Elise's spirit. They're told to find answers at an abandoned hospital where Lorraine used to work as a doctor. Lorraine recounts a story that happened 25 years ago when a patient named Parker Crane was admitted for trying to castrate himself. He ended up actually having assaulted Josh. She saw Parker some days later, and when she asked the nurse why he was out of bed, the nurse seemed confused and actually told Lorraine that he jumped to his death the day before. So the group goes to the Crane family home, where they find a secret room that contains numerous corpses. There's also a black wedding gown and newspaper clippings, which reveal Parker to be a serial killer known as the Bride in Black, who had kidnapped and murdered young women while dressed as a woman himself. At this point, Josh's body is slowly starting to deteriorate, and Renee realizes at this point that he's possessed. Lorraine insists that they all need to get away from Josh. Carl, Specs, and Tucker arrive, and they drug him, but he ends up overpowering and subduing them. Carl then wakes up in the spirit realm of the Further, where he meets the spirits of the real Josh and Elise. In the Further, they realize that time moves non-chronologically there, and Josh is able to communicate with himself as a child to locate Parker's house in the Further. Meanwhile, back in the physical world, Josh, who is possessed, ambushes Lorraine and Renee. They end up escaping to the basement with the children when Dalton voluntarily enters the Further to help his father. While there, Josh and the others find Parker's house, where they witness Parker's mother, Michelle, who's the woman in the white dress, abusing him and forcing him to act like a girl. It's then discovered that Parker had killed his victims at the behest of his mother's spirit. Elise then ends up saving Josh and appears to destroy Michelle's spirit, which stops the possessed Josh from murdering his family in the real world. Carl and Josh also escape, and Dalton leads them back to the living world, allowing Josh to finally regain control of his body. The Lambert family gets reunited. Josh and Dalton once again have their memories suppressed by Carl. So sometime later, we see Specs and Tucker. They're arriving at a house of a family whose daughter Allison is in an unexplained coma. We then see Elsie's spirit pass through between them and go into Allison's room. However, she's confronted by an unseen figure as a creaking sound is heard. And that ends us off for Insidious Chapter 2 and leaves us with where we are right now. That's where we are in the Insidious story. So Insidious Chapter 5 is dropping. It's going to take place 10 years after the events that we just talked about. We know the red-faced demon is going to be coming back. We know that the Lambert family is all coming back. But that's really about it. And we also know it's going to be fucking terrifying because that trailer definitely looked like it's going to have some good, scary moments. Personally, I'm super excited for Insidious 5. I think it's going to be great. I think it's going to be an awesome film. It is also the directorial debut of Patrick Wilson. Patrick Wilson, who plays Josh Lambert, he is going to be the one directing Insidious 5, which I think is great. Like, Patrick Wilson has been around, Conjuring, Insidious. He knows James Wan's style. I truly think he's going to do a great job for Insidious 5. I think he'll knock it out of the park. And not only does that wrap us up for the Insidious story, that wraps us up for this episode of the podcast. Next week, we're going to be starting our Decade in Review series. We're going into the 1970s, which was voted on by you guys through Instagram. The first film we're going to be going over is Wizard of Gore. I was going to do it on this episode, but I figured because we're doing a franchise review, I didn't want to add, just some random 70s movie right at the end of it, right? We're going over Insidious. We're doing the whole franchise. Might as well save our 70s Decade in Review for next week. So if you want to hear all about the 1970s movie Wizard of Gore, tune in next week when we start our 1970s Decade in Review series. And not only are we going to go over Wizard of Gore, we're also going to go over Malignant. I love that film. That was a lot of fun. The twist was absolutely something. I'll talk about that in more detail next week, but stay tuned for Malignant and The Wizard of Gore coming to you on all podcast platforms next week. And in the meantime, you can follow me where I am always hanging out. That is on Instagram, instagram.com/Cabin of Horrors podcast. I'm also hanging out on Twitch all the freaking time. I'm literally on Twitch 14 hours a day, pretty much. So come follow me on Twitch, twitch.tv/Cabin of Horrors, and drop a follow, say hi. Tell me what your favorite horror movie is. And until next time, see you in the shadows.